Hey, Mitch.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to 30 minutes of Torah study for the holiday of Pesach. Now, for many people, the Seder is truly the highlight event of the year. You sit around the table with family, with friends, you enjoy some classic Pesach foods, your family engages in very familiar traditions. However, for some people, they don't enjoy the Seder that much. They're not that excited about it, and it certainly is not the highlight event for the year. And they asked one question, not four questions. They asked one question. Why do we have to repeat the same thing every single year? The same text, the same questions, the same story. Why do we got to do it again? And there are people who attempt to bring in new traditions, new angles, new perspectives. They're putting things on the Seder plate representing new and interesting modern causes, because something about the Haggadah is just, why do we have to do it again? Why must we repeat the same Seder every year? How is the Exodus still relevant to us today? Now, the answer to this question, of course, is right there in the Haggadah, but we don't always notice it. We don't always see it at first glance. So we are going to look at the first paragraph of the Haggadah, and we're going to analyze it almost word by word in order that we can really appreciate and capture what the message of Pesach is really all about. So the Seder begins and we say, Hey Lachmanya. This is the bread of affliction that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Now, before you continue, we have some questions here, because this sentence does not exactly make sense. Now, why do we eat matzah on Pesach? The Haggadah tells us the reason. The reason is because when the Jews left Egypt, they were rushing. There was no time for the dough to rise, so they ran out of Egypt so quickly that all they had was matzah. So did the Jewish people eat matzah in Egypt? No, they ate the matzah when they were running out of Egypt, which means the bread that they ate was not bread of affliction. It was bread of liberation that they ate as they were running out of slavery. So how exactly are we supposed to understand this opening sentence of the Haggadah? Then it continues, whoever is hungry, come and eat. Whoever is in need, come and participate in the Paschal Lamb. So again, this is a beautiful paragraph as we are inviting people who are less fortunate than us. We are inviting people who are needy. We are fulfilling the very Jewish mitzvah and the value of tzedakah, hachnasas orchim, bringing guests into our house. However, it does seem to contradict the spirit of the Haggadah. It contradicts the spirit of the holiday. The holiday is liberation, freedom, drinking 4 cups of wine, having elaborate meals, using our fanciest china. Pesach is a holiday of liberation and freedom. Why are we announcing at the beginning of the Seder, oh, by the way, we're supposed to be this liberated people, but we're also impoverished and there are people who are hungry as well? Why do we highlight our suffering on this night? Obviously, we're going to invite people who are less fortunate than us to the Seder. Of course, we're going to call people, but why do we make an announcement at the Seder, which is supposed to be all about liberation, and we highlight our suffering? We are surrounded, as we are traditionally, in luxury. Why do we trumpet the fact that there are needy among us? It doesn't seem to be consistent with the energy of the Seder. This paragraph then continues. This year we are here. Next year we will be in the land of Israel. This year we are enslaved. Next year we will be free. Again, this paragraph calls out for interpretation because it also does not seem to make sense on the surface. The holiday of Pesach means we are celebrating our liberation from slavery. Yet what did we just say? This year we are exiled. This year we are slaves. What is that supposed to be all about? Are we liberated or are we slaves? Why open the Seder mentioning the fact that we are currently slaves if the whole point of the Seder is to celebrate our liberation? Now, this question is not only a question that applies to the night of the Seder. This is a general question that we need to understand. How did we get here? Why is it that the Jewish people right now are in exile? Right? Why were the freedoms and prosperity that were granted us on this night, the liberation from slavery, reversed? What's the story of Jewish history? We were slaves in Egypt. There was a miraculous exodus from Egypt. We were redeemed from slavery. We became tremendously wealthy, physically, spiritually. We arrive in the land of Israel, but then the temples are destroyed. We're exiled from the land of Israel. There are crusades. There are expulsions. There's pogroms. There's the Holocaust. There's terrorist attacks. And where do we find ourselves today? In Milwaukee. We're a far way from Exodus from Egypt. We're far away from being wealthy physically and spiritually in our own land, in the land of Israel, freed from slavery, celebrating. How did we end up in Milwaukee today? Where did we go wrong, right? How do we understand this? In order to understand why and how we are where we are today, and how this relates to Pesach, we need to understand the Exodus from Egypt from a historical perspective. We need to look at it in a historical context. Why did the Jewish people end up in Egypt? What does that slavery represent? What is the meaning of the joy surrounding the Exodus? And then, of course, we have to apply that to today, to make it meaningful, to make it relevant, and to make it all practical. So we have to go back in time, 5,782 years, to the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve are the first human beings that are created. They're living in absolute physical and spiritual paradise. They are tangibly able to experience God. There are no distractions. There is no temptation for sin or anything of that nature. In the Garden of Eden, spirituality, Torah, and mitzvahs is tantalizingly attractive. Any concept of sin or material pleasure is unbelievably repulsive. However, there's a tree growing in the Garden of Eden. It is called the tree of knowledge of good and evil. If you eat from that tree, all of a sudden, sin changes from being something which is foreign, unattractive, repulsive, not even within your frame of reference at all, something so distant. All of a sudden, you eat it, you know it, you feel it. Now you're tempted by it. Now you're attracted to it. And all of a sudden, spirituality pales in comparison. So they are told, do not eat from the tree in the Garden of Eden. The Orach Chaim writes, God's primary reason for prohibiting the tree of knowledge was to prevent the human mind from grasping or perceiving the notion of transgression, to be focused completely on holiness without conceiving of the possibility of turning from God. This is what King Solomon meant when he wrote, God made man upright. The human was made with only one kind of knowledge, that of holiness. Thoughts of transgression did not figure into our imagination and fantasies at the time of our creation. This is the state of Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Spirituality, retractive. Sin, repulsive. No frame of reference to even understand it. Along comes the snake. The snake convinces Chava to eat from the tree of knowledge. She gives some of the fruit of the tree of knowledge to Adam, and all of a sudden, everything changes. Suddenly, there is a gigantic barrier between mankind and God. No longer is the presence of God tangible. It's hidden. It's concealed. Suddenly, sin becomes appealing, attractive, desirous, and spirituality becomes hard to understand. It's distant, not so appealing, not so attractive. Adam and Eve suddenly recognize that they are naked, and they feel shame because all of a sudden their bodies are no longer spiritual instruments, godly instruments, which with the mitzvahs can be performed, but there's ulterior motives. There's desires, there's cravings, there's lust, and they feel shame. They are kicked out of the Garden of Eden. They are banished into the rest of the world, and things only get worse from there. Idolatry, right? Pagan worship spreads. We know, of course, the story of the flood. God's presence is almost invisible, not perceptive. No one is familiar with it in the world after the Garden of Eden. But then Abraham comes along and he reverses course. He recognizes that there's a God who created heaven and earth. He starts teaching people about monotheism. There's meaning and purpose to life, morality, ethics. He has a son Yitzchak. He has a son Yaakov, right? They have children, and all of a sudden they are trailblazers, having a huge impact in the world, making the presence more real, more concrete, and more people are coming close to God. This culminates in the giving of the Torah, where God descends on Mount Sinai. The presence of God is tangible and concrete, and what the sin of Adam and Eve is rectified, it is reversed. However, there is a big difference between the tangible experience of God in the Garden of Eden of Adam and Chava and the tangible experience of God that we experienced when the Torah was given at Mount Sinai. The difference is that Adam and Chava did nothing to deserve the experience of a tangible God in the Garden of Eden. They were born into it. They were created into it. It was gifted to them. It purely was from above to below. It was not a product of anything that they did to deserve it. However, when the Jewish people received the Torah Mount Sinai and God descended and manifested himself to us and once again became a tangible experience for the Jewish people, that was a product of hard work. That was Abraham blazing a trail of monotheism in a very pagan and idol-worshiping environment. He worked hard and passed it to his son Yitzchak, who passed it to his son Yaakov, who inspired tens of thousands of people, ultimately leading to a Jewish nation that stood before God on Mount Sinai and said, Nasa v'nishma, whatever the Torah is, we will do it. You could explain to us the rules later, but we are absolutely in. In Kabbalistic terminology, the divine experience in the Garden of Eden was from above to below. Who initiated it? It was God who was from above. However, the divine experience at Mount Sinai, the Jewish people initiated it. It was from below to above in the sense that it was not a gift that they had to work towards it. See, this is the words of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. The Jewish mystics distinguished between the two types of divine human encounter. They called them Isarusa de Liela and Isarusa de Lasata, respectively an awakening from above and an awakening from below. The first is initiated by God, the second by mankind. An awakening from above is spectacular, supernatural, an event that bursts through the chains of causality that at other times bind the natural world. An awakening from below has no such grandeur. It is a gesture that is human, all too human. Yet there is another difference between them in the opposite direction. An awakening from above may change nature, but it does not in and of itself change human nature. In it, no human effort has been expended. Those to whom it happens are passive. While it lasts, it's overwhelming, but only while it lasts. Thereafter, people revert to what they were. An awakening from below, by contrast, leaves a permanent mark. Because human beings have taken the initiative, something in them changes. The horizons of possibility have been expanded. They now know they are capable of great things. And because they did so once, they are aware that they can do so again. An awakening from above temporarily transforms the external world. An awakening from below permanently transforms our internal world. The first changes the universe. The second changes us. So in the Garden of Eden, the inspiration was initiated from on high, hence not fully impacting below. The world was not changed. Adam and Eve were not changed. The world remained as it is because it was a gift from above, from up high to below. However, when inspiration is initiated from below, that leaves a lasting yet personal impact. Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, they were transformed and changed people because God did not appear to them, rather they appeared before God. A totally different experience. But now we are left with a challenge. Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, they worked on themselves, they transformed themselves, they changed themselves to the extent that for them, they were able to tangibly experience God. Moshe had a daunting task. He had to inspire the entire nation to seek out God. How does the entire nation become inspired, changed, and transformed people, just like Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, to the extent that they will be able to see God tangibly in the world without it having to be a gift from God? How does a whole nation get to that spiritual level? So Jewish tradition tells us this is where the slavery in Egypt came in. Egypt is a proverbial furnace, like a refining pot for silver and a kiln for gold. A kiln separates the base metals from silver and gold so that the silver becomes pure rather than a mixture of precious and base metals. Egypt too acted as a kiln. The harsh bondage working with clay and bricks refined the Jewish people and separated the bad from the good. So why is it that the Jewish people needed to be slaves in Egypt? Why did this have to play out as an event that was part of the history of the Jewish people? Number one, we have to recognize that in no way, shape, or form is slavery good. That is not what we are trying to say at all. However, there is a blessing in suffering. Because when we experience pain or tragedy, when we suffer in life, it very often refocuses our perspective. Unfortunately, when there is a terrorist attack amongst the Jewish people, people are able to ignore what divides us, and the Jewish people can unite in a very powerful and beautiful way. Because when we are suffering, when we are in pain, when there is a tragedy, we tend to focus on what is actually valuable. We focus on what life is really about, the purpose of our creation, actual meaning in life. And in that circumstance, we recognize that the trivial pleasures that we run after, that we pursue, that take up so much of our life, what they really are is trivial pleasures. That's not what's important. That's not what matters. And we're able to set them aside, and we're able to focus. Very often, in an experience of pain and suffering, we can develop our spiritual sensitivity because we're focused on what's really valuable. This is what the experience of slavery is all about. The Jewish people needed to experience a suffering that completely and totally transformed their way of thinking. The trivial, the physical, the material, that which was not necessary was able to be put to the side, and that which is the most valuable in life, spirituality, holiness, godliness, would become the main pursuit, the main objective, and the focal point of the Jewish people. Then they would be ready for the world to be transformed and for God to once again be tangible. Now, did it work? Did it work that the Jewish people went through the experience of slavery and came out the other side, a spiritually enlightened people, ready to perceive God in everything in their life? Unfortunately, it did not work 100%. There was progress, but not 100%. What happened? The Jewish people were influenced by the Egyptians. The Jewish people started taking upon values, traditions, and practices from the Egyptians with which they were living. The Torah actually says that the Jewish people sunk to the 49th level of impurity. If they remained in Egypt one more moment longer, they simply would have been irredeemable. They would have lost any trace, any sense of their Jewish identity, and they would have been gone. They were this close from not deserving to be redeemed. So God had to step in. God had to perform the miracles before Paro, the 10 plagues, the exodus from Egypt, the splitting of the Red Sea. And when it came to Mount Sinai, did the Jewish people deserve God to reveal himself to them at Mount Sinai? Was spirituality the most pressing, the most important, the most dominant characteristic in their life? No, it was not. So what did God do? There was a revelation from above to below. God descended at Mount Sinai and he revealed himself to the Jewish people. There are long-term consequences of this failure, so to speak, of the Jewish people to fully dedicate and commit themselves at this time. We go to the Ber Mayim Chaim. He writes, now if the Jews had been worthy of redemption, the barrier between the Jews and God would have disappeared completely, forevermore, never to be remembered or mentioned again. However, because they escaped Egypt in a less than optimal state, the barrier remained. It can still exert influence over the Jewish soul, depending on the measure of its power and stature, which is commensurate with the state of the Jew at any given time. So the Jewish people emerged from slavery in Egypt. They were not refined enough. They could not on their own perceive spirituality in the world. They were immersed in the materialism of Egypt. God had to initiate the relationship, and therefore it was temporary. For the Jewish people who left Egypt, sin was quite attractive and was quite tempting. Spirituality did not exactly have the same pull. So we were not refined enough, and God is still waiting for us while we are struggling with our very temptations and our urges. Which leads us then to the next question. That if the Exodus does not represent some type of permanent freedom, then why celebrate it? This is question number 2. Why are we celebrating an Exodus that was not complete? How are we to experience a state of liberty and freedom we don't really have? How could we call the Seder an experience of Exodus and liberation when the reality is we are still enslaved to our more base, more coarse, more mundane desires, cravings, and attractions? Because this is such a huge issue, because this point that we just addressed is so big, therefore it is addressed in the very first paragraph of the Haggadah. We are going to face this challenge head on. We are not going to ignore it. We're not going to shove it under the rug. In the first paragraph of the Haggadah, what does it say? We're sitting here at a Seder. We're supposed to be in liberation. We're surrounded by luxury. But you know what we're eating? We're not eating the bread of liberation. We're eating the bread of affliction that our ancestors ate in Egypt. Because to a certain degree, we are still in Egypt. And we mentioned that there's the poor and there's the needy around us. Why should there be poor and needy around us? We should be liberated. We should be in Israel with the temple, with kings, with physical, spiritual luxury. Yet we are in exile, surrounded by the poor and the needy. Why? Because we did not live up to our end of the bargain. To a certain degree, we're still in Egypt. And that's why we say in the very first paragraph, this year, we are still slaves. This year, we are in exile. But what's our goal? Our goal is ultimately next year, we're going to make it out of here. We're going to work hard and we'll experience the full liberation and we'll make it to Jerusalem. So in the very first paragraph of the Seder, we acknowledge our limitations. We acknowledge it and we say, you know what? We are going to strive to do better. We're eating the bread of affliction. You know why? Because we never fully left Egypt. We took the Jew out of Egypt, but we never took the Egypt out of the Jew. we still are interested in, and we still desire, and we are still attracted to things. That is what Egypt represented. The Rebbe says this is the meaning of the second sentence of the opening passage. Whoever is hungry, whoever is in need, we still suffer poverty, suffering, exile, and subjugation, because our ancestors remained in Egypt. They never really escaped their submission to the culture of Egypt. There's poor, there's hungry that's around us. Because we never fully left, we never were fully liberated. So here we have the answer to question number one. Question number one was, why do we highlight our suffering on this night? And why were the freedom and the prosperity granted on this night reversed? The answer is the opening statement of the Seder night explains that the matzah identifies our partial exodus from Egypt. We never fully left. We're still in this slave mentality, and we still celebrate the effort toward the final redemption. But why are we at the Seder? Because we are orienting ourselves, we are focusing ourselves, we are pointing ourselves towards redemption, towards liberation. We acknowledge today we're slaves, but the goal is to experience ultimately liberation. So why do we celebrate? We may not be fully liberated yet, but the original exodus from Egypt and the Pesach, which we celebrate today, opens a door for us. It opens a door for us which we can walk through. It's a path which we can travel on to experience that ultimate liberation. Again, we have the Ber Mayim Chayim. He says, however, the Jewish people do not rest or stand idly by. They constantly observe the divine commandments day and night, each commensurate with their own ability. Thereby their souls escape the barriers a little each day, until the time arrives when the good works of the Jews will strip this barrier of all power. At that time, the Jewish people will experience a final redemption, not to be followed by any subsequent exile. What this means is the exodus from Egypt was not just a historical event, it is an ongoing process. We are obligated to leave Egypt just a little bit every single day, to work on ourselves, to become more refined, to become more spiritually sensitive, to focus and desire that which is spiritual, holy, positive, and to be less focused on the physical, the material, and the selfish. We're supposed to be going every single day a little further away from Egypt and a little bit closer to the land of Israel. The Rebbe says the passage therefore continues and state that indeed we are now here, but next year we will be in Israel. We might be enslaved now, but next year we will be free. The exodus from Egypt opened the path and pipeline of redemption that will lead eventually to the complete redemption next year in the land of Israel as a free people. Therefore, we can fulfill the mitzvah of telling the story of our exodus from Egypt on this night and of experiencing it this night as if we have completely emerged from our subjugation to Egypt. In fact, by telling the story of the exodus as if we were leaving Egypt today, we are liberated for the moment from our subjugation to Egypt and thus pave the way to becoming truly free. This is in accordance with the teaching that the entire time span from the exodus from Egypt until the future redemption is a continual and progressive process of leaving Egypt. So every single day, right, we try to move a little bit closer. Once a year, we take a giant leap. And that is on Pesach, we have a Seder. We acknowledge that our exodus from Egypt was incomplete, but we are working on it. So why are we celebrating an exodus that wasn't complete? Because exodus is an ongoing process of self-refinement that will culminate with the coming of Mashiach. We recognize we're not there yet. At the beginning of the Seder, we say we were enslaved. We recognize that there's hungry people around us. We recognize that in every generation, there are those who rise up against us to kill us, including right now. So at the same time, we're celebrating the Exodus and liberation and freedom. We're acknowledging that there are enemies who rise up against us today. We mentioned the 4 sons, right? Even the wicked son is happening today. Yes, this year we are slaves, but next year we're going to be free. Because every day our priorities change and grow. And during the Seder, we're trying to make huge leaps and bounds to the extent that we value godliness, that we're going to see godliness, that we're going to pursue godliness. So we celebrate Pesach to empower us to continue the Exodus journey in the present and finally reach our destination, which is the coming of Mashiach. This is why we do this every single year, because every single year we need to liberate ourselves just a little bit more. We acknowledge we're not there yet. We are still to some degree stuck in Egypt, but every day and every year, just a little bit less, and we're that much closer to the land of Israel, and we need to make sure that the Seder is a push, right? It pushes us and motivates us. It propels us to move forward. Tomorrow night, Wednesday evening, there's an incredible event taking place at the Marcus Theater in Mequon. Up on the big movie theater screen, there's a fascinating video called a Fabrengen, an inside look. We're going to get a behind the scenes look and appreciate and experience what the Fabrengen was all about. And we're also going to get an update from Ukraine. Rabbi Yisrael Silberstein, the chief rabbi of Chernihiv, Ukraine, he'll give us an update as to what's happening, who's there, who's leaving, who's safe, who's in danger, what the needs are. This is something you don't want to miss. RSVP on chabadwi.org/Rebbe120. Emails have been sent out, so you should have the information. Please, I strongly encourage you, come, share it with your friends. It is worth it. You don't want to miss it. And lastly, 30 minutes of Torah study is going to have to be on a new night. What do I mean by this? Next week, there's not going to be a class as we lead up to Pesach. During Pesach, there's no class. After Pesach, there's a shul trip to Israel. So I'm going to get back from that trip on May 4th. When I come back, we have to figure out a new night for Torah studies because on Tuesday night is softball. The shul plays softball. The Black Hats are playing. Games are 6 to 7 or 7 to 8. It's not going to work. Wednesday nights, I'm going to be teaching the next JLI class, which is absolutely phenomenal. You should sign up for that as well. So we're going to have to figure out, I don't know if there's another night I can do it. What I might do is do it in the middle of the day. I know it might not be convenient for everyone, but let's say 12:30 p.m. to 1 p.m., something like that. Do it in the middle of the day. Those who can attend can attend. Otherwise, it will be recorded and posted online. So that is the information. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. I want to wish everyone a happy, a sweet, a beautiful, inspired, awesome Pesach.